Hello and welcome to part 5 of our Ivy Growth project. This part's all about rendering, so we're going to be dealing with cameras, lighting, materials, and then final output. But for now, let's get familiar with the cameras that have been added since the last part. If I jump into our camera wide and let's play back, I've deactivated the XP spline meshes and we get some nice quick playback whilst we're reviewing the cameras here. And you can see we get that nice clustering at the top there. That's probably the great reveal at the end. Then we've got this nice shot at the beginning, catching them growing at the beginning here. And then finally, I've got one that sort of is pretty close up, and it follows them up as they're growing up this side of the arch here. Okay. Now, something to note when framing up cameras for this kind of thing, you'll want your safe frames to be really visible. Now, I haven't got them very opaque at the moment, and they're quite subtle. So if you need to see those a bit clearer, you hit Shift V, and then in the View tab, Tinted Border, and then I just whack that up to 100%. And that just gives you a better idea of what exactly framing you're going to see, at the sacrifice of a bit of the viewport space, but I think it's worth doing to get a more accurate idea of the shot. So those are our cameras, and they also each have a focus null, and that's driving the focus distance of each of the cameras, and that's going to be really useful later on when we're dealing with depth of field. But for now, we're going to look at lighting the scene, and we're going to do that using a cycles environment and sunlight. Let's deactivate our Ivy Growth system because we don't need that on just at the moment. We'll develop the materials for that later. Let's come up to our Cycles 4D menu and add two objects. We'll add a Sci environment, and then we'll go back in and we're going to add a light. Now, first off, we'll take a look at the Cycles environment. And it's best to, if you're working in Cycles, of course, it's good to have a layout for Cycles 4D with the real-time preview and the node editor. So I'm going to open up mine, Cycles 4D, and this is the real-time preview, and down here I've got my node editor docked. So if I double-click this background material that's been added, we can see it's this pink color. That's because it can't find any textures, and because I haven't assigned any yet. But I'm actually not going to use this. This is a image texture node. I'm going to use something called the sky texture. So I filter over here for sky, and then I'm just going to connect that up to our background. And then in this attributes manager here with the sky texture node selected, I'm going to actually, the sun direction from object, I'm going to set the object to be our light. Okay, so that's the basics of that setup. And if I hit render right now, so let's just check my devices. Yes, I'm using my GPUs. Hit render and let that load up. And you can see there is a sky, but it's very dark at the moment. And that's because this light is at world 0, and the environment is basically using the translation or the transformation of this light object to set the sky's look. So if I move this around in space, you'll see I'll bring it up, it becomes sort of a daytime. And if I move it down lower, it becomes nighttime. But you could move this manually, but it would be much better to have this automated. And we can do that by right-clicking this light tag here, going to the Cinema 4D tags and finding the sun expression. And as you can see, it's actually positioned the light object based on the time and date, and also the longitude and latitude. So this is really useful when you're doing sun scenes. Okay, so I'm going to actually whip back time a little bit, and I'm going to go back to sort of June. And let's start with sort of daytime. And that's looking quite nice at 3. But you'll notice the sun is it's not very bright at the moment. And the reason is that the if you can see it by the icon here, it's currently in like an omni light. It's emitting from this position here, when in reality we want it to be a light that is incredibly far away. And so if I go to our cycles tag, and I'm going to change the light type from point light to infinite or sunlight, and you can see there that allows you to do this. Now, obviously, that's incredibly bright right now, so you want to drop that down. And let's do 10 to start with. 5. There we go. And you can play around with the timing on the sun and all that and we can do that later when we're fine tuning. But for now, you've got this very simple, nice and easy to set up sky system. And we could play around with the turbidity here in the sky just to show you what that does. Imagine it being sort of the scattering in the atmosphere. So it's how much the sun rays get scattered by our atmosphere. But I'm going to leave that all at default for now, and we're going to move on and focus on developing materials for the leaves. Firstly, though, we can have a quick look at the materials of the ruins. Let's jump to our default camera. Let's just zoom in. And you can see we've got these procedural materials. These are not textures, they are actually procedural materials. And they're just giving the stones. We've got the ground dirt here. We've also got this wooden base and also like a felt underneath. We're never going to see that. It's just there if you wanted to mess around with different camera angles. But let's take a quick look at how the masonry stones were built. So we jump to the ruins layer tab here and click on masonry stones. Now this looks like a bit of an intimidating node graph. If I hit H, I'll frame them all. But actually, it's actually all very straightforward, and you can build pretty complex node graphs fairly quickly. And the way you can navigate this makes it very easy. I just wanted to show you one part of this system. So we've got different things. We've got noises being added in, colorful noises, but also that each stone has a different unique color. So if I look at the object info node here and I solo this random channel, we'll see that the stones are being assigned a random value from 0 to 1, and that's translating obviously as color. 1 would be pure white, 0 would be black. And what this allows me to do is it allows us to remap those shadings into all sorts of different colors. And I'm using this color ramp here to do that. And I'm also using it for other stuff like mixing in sort of roughness values, that kind of thing. But if I uncheck that and let it load up again, it's what gives this subtle variation. And each of these stones will have a pretty unique color. All right. So like I said, we're going to now move on to developing the leaf materials. So first of all, let's frame up a leaf. So first, hide our ruin. Let's open up our IV growth null here, and we can make our cameras a bit smaller as well. Open up our generators, and they are in here. And then remember, we moved them down in Y. So if we want to bring them back up to world 0 for now to just work on them, that's fine. So currently negative 5,000. Just right click there and bring them up. Now, if I zoom into them here, they're all overlapping, but I'm just going to focus on one of these. So if we let's hide all of those, and let's just focus on this one here. Now you can see it's not rendering any texture to the RTP here because we haven't got a Cycles material on it. And we're also doing some stuff that Cycles doesn't really know what's going on because it doesn't deal with the front and back materials. So that's a Cinema 4D thing that I was utilizing just for the viewport. So we need to replace these materials with Cycles materials, and let's start doing that by adding a material we can start working from in the Cycles menu. So create Cycles 4D and then object material. So add the object material, and then we could actually drag that into our IV system just so it's next to our other materials. Let's rename it straight away. Let's call it Leaf 01. And we don't need to call it top or bottom because it's going to contain both of those encapsulated in one material. So if I actually drag that onto our leaf copy here, I'll just drag it on as a separate material, and then I'll hide these two. So you can hide the viewport ones just by adding an X into the selection there or something. Make sure you don't have a tag with X on it, of course. But now we can take a look at our BSDF here, our principled BSDF. And this is essentially a sort of a very convenient shader node that allows you to deal with all sorts of different shading modes. So you have the specular, metallic, stuff like that, roughness, transmission for sort of glassy looking materials. But we're really going to be keeping it fairly simple. We're going to work with the base color, we're going to work with the specular and some roughness, and then we're also going to add a bump to this. So if I just change the base color, you see that we can drive the color directly like that. But what we want to do, of course, we want to input this leaf texture or several leaf textures in as our source. So I'm going to grab an image texture node, so we could filter here, or I could just clear that filter and go down to texture, and then image texture. And then in here, because we already have these loaded into our scene, I can just hit the bitmaps section here and load in leaf 01 top diffuse. Now, when I added that, it's not connected up to anything, so we don't see anything in the real-time preview. But if I solo this channel, we can see that texture's loading in nicely. If I connect it up to the principled BSDF, we also get some shading, so we maintain that shading. And you can see we've got our shape, but it's still not masking out. It's still not, the alpha isn't displaying here. Now there's a couple of ways we can do this. We can connect this alpha up to this alpha port on the output, or we can mix the principled BSDF with another alpha. And I find that a bit more reliable when we're dealing with multiple layers. So I'm going to grab a transparent BSDF. So add that there. Let's add a mix shader. So a mix shader like so. And then if we connect these up, and I'll do it this way around to start with. And then the factor is how much it's mixing and which way round it is. So you can see if I go to one end, it's the fully transparent. And then if I go the other, all the way to the full factor, it's the full principled BSDF. But if I solo our alpha here, which is embedded in the PNG, I can connect that up as our factor, and you'll see it treats it like an alpha now. So we've now got a nice transparency showing for our leaf. Okay, so we've got our diffuse. Now let's add in our bump. I think that's the easiest one to start with. So let's add another texture node. So image texture, and then we can load in the bump. I'm going to use the height for this. So I'm going to load them in from the browser. So I'm going to open up my browser, and you can see we've got the top height is this one here. I'm going to want all of these at some point. So I'm going to add that one now. And then if I add another image texture node, I can grab the specular at the same time as well. So let's grab the top specular, and let's put that to one side for now whilst we deal with the bump here, the height or relief map. So let's add a bump node. There we go. Connect that color up to the height. So this is the height map, and we need to connect it up to the height. And then this normal goes into the BSDF's normal here. Now it's not immediately apparent. You might have seen it just slightly change, but you'll need to move around to see it really clearly. In fact, what would be more useful to diagnose this texture is to go for a more simple lighting setup. So I'm just going to deactivate our sun and our cycles environment. I'm just going to add a standard point light cycles light over here. It's very bright at the moment, like so. And then what I can do is I can reduce down the bump and increase it, and it should be a little more clear. In fact, if I just make sure our light is just catching nicely there. We can increase the specular, of course, and then if I increase the roughness, it'll actually really show off the specular lighting. So we definitely don't need it quite as high as that. We're going to drive this with the texture in a minute anyway. There we go. So the light is very bright, so I'll just notch that down a little bit to 50, maybe 25. There we go. And I'll add another one underneath as well. So let's add another one down here, just so we've got some lighting for the underside as well. Okay, so we can see that our bump is active. And if we move the light around, you can see the veins of the leaf are showing nicely. However, it is currently inverted. So you can see it's actually, these veins should kind of be sinking back down into it. So I'm just going to hit invert on the bump there. And there we go. We get a more realistic looking bump map. Excellent. So the next thing we want to do is we want to drive the specular channel. We want to restrict the areas where we are actually getting specular. So I can move this bump down now that we're pretty happy with how that's looking. Pull that down here. Grab our specular texture. And if I connect that directly up to our specular here, we won't see too much of a difference because the areas that are not going to be specular are kind of already knocked back in the bump anyway, so it's kind of hard to see exactly what's going on. But if I add a color ramp in between them, like so, and I make sure that the color output of the ramp is connected up, sometimes it'll want to automatically connect similar looking or similar outputs. So this is a factor to factor when we want it to actually be color to factor here. So if I solo this color ramp, you can see what we're doing. We can use this color ramp to kind of clip it and create a more contrasted map. So if I make it quite extreme, you'll see that the specular starts to only appear where the white value is. So I want it to be a little bit more contrasted, but not too much, like so. And then I'm going to utilize the same map to create some variation in the roughness. So I'm just going to control drag that down, connect that up there, and then into the roughness here. So with the roughness, that's not going to look quite correct because it's got extreme values here. So we want them to be a bit more subtle. So if we expand our ramp here, we can drop these down and not have them quite so extreme, but we don't want them to go to 0. Like so. And there we go. So we're starting to get a good idea of what the leaf is going to look like. And remember, we're viewing this very close up at the moment. These are only 512 by 512 textures, and they're really designed for that huge cluster of ivy that we have. So if you've got higher res textures that you want to use for close-ups, go for it. But for now, these are what we need to get the wide shots and the close shots done. All right, so let's just do our final tweaks on these color ramps. I'm going to make the specular a little less contrasted, and I'm also going to cap the maximum. So if I go too low, it'll actually barely reflect. And the light we've got at the moment is quite a bright one. I'm also going to make the roughness a little bit sort of more subtle. Excellent. And let's zoom out and let's rotate around, just get a better idea. I might increase the bump as well, so let's just grab the bump node. I'm going to set that to 0.15, so it's a little bit more. And there we go. Okay, so let's just tidy up the node graph a touch. So let's double click here. Double click on these larger image texture nodes. They're the ones that are taking up the most space. Everything else is fine. And let's just drag our bump up to here as well. And there we go. So that now our little group of nodes here, which make up the top leaf, I can actually frame these. I can put them in a frame. So if I right click, frame selected, and that allows me to, so I could actually rename this top leaf. And it allows me to duplicate this now as a whole group. So with all of its connections and everything intact, apart from the one going out that way, this will actually enable me to quickly reuse this for the bottom texture. So if I just hold Control or Command and drag, you can see there we've just duplicated that entire frame. And I could rename this one as well. So let's go for bottom leaf. And what we'll do is we're going to change the textures that are associated with these image texture nodes. So where we can actually change the name of stuff quite simply. So where we've got leaf 01 top, I can actually just write bottom. Same with this one, the leaf top specular. Now, because we are dealing with a pretty simple specular on the bottom here, I'm actually going to get rid of these nodes. We don't need those for the bottom the bottom texture, but we definitely want a height map for this lower part. So just change that top to bottom. And you'll notice you might need to rename the nodes, but that's worked out. It's automatically renamed them. If you've deliberately renamed them, it might need, you might have to rename them again, but that's worked perfectly for us. And currently the alphas is all good as well, but we are not connecting that up to the output. So if I solo this mix shader, that is now the back material and it's on both sides. So how are we going to assign one of these to the bottom and one of them to the top of this leaf? Well, because we know it's one polygon thick, we can utilize something called back facing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an input node and I'm going to grab the geometry input node. If I zoom into it, it gives us a few options. It gives us sort of position, normals, tangents, true normals, that kind of stuff. But really the one we want to use here is called back facing. And when I solo it there, it appears that it's doing nothing. But if I move the camera to the underside, you can see that it's given a value to the underside. And the top one is a 0 and the bottom one is 1. So what we can do with this is we can have this drive the factor of a mix node. So let's get a mix shader, connect that up to the back facing there. And then if we connect up our top leaf and our bottom leaf, and then connect that up to our output, and then we look underside, we've now got the bottom leaf is correctly assigned like so. Can you see that? So we've got the top material is correct and the bottom material, but this is all within the one shader graph. And that is really convenient because now we can duplicate these and create the other shaders for the other materials for these particular leaves. But one last feature of this shader that I want to have some translucency. So currently we do have a light underneath here, but if I turn that light off and we look at the top surface of this light, we're actually not getting any light on the underside. There's no light coming through the leaf. And leaves in real life tend to have this translucency to them. So what we can do is we just need to basically add, in between the principled and the mix shader, we need to add a translucency node. So that'll give us the underside translucency. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to utilize the diffuse for that color. But first of all, let's move these over here. And let's search for a translucency node. Now, translucency differs from transparency, the transparent BSDF, in that you can think of it like this. You can think of the translucent BSDF as frosted glass. It actually disperses and diffuses the rays as they go through the surface, whereas the transparent BSDF just allows all the rays to pass through it and will just tint it depending on, so that's like clear glass essentially, and this is like frosted glass. So what I want to do is, I'm just to test it out, I'm going to attach it up to this principled BSDF. I'm going to actually add it to that. So we want them to blend together. So I'm going to connect that up here. I can just put that one in the shader 2 slot. It doesn't actually matter which order these are added together because the add operation is the same either way. So if I look on the underside now, we'll see that the underside has turned white. And that's because I'm adding this translucent over the top of everything. And if I give it some color, you'll see that we can set it that way. But what I want to do is I actually want to drive it using the diffuse color. And then I'm also going to be able to control that further using an HSV. So currently there's no particularly easy way for me to reduce down the translucency of this leaf. There's no lights under here. So if I look above, you can see, and below, you can see that it's doing its job in backface lighting this surface. So what I need to do is I need to add an HSV, and I'm going to add that in between the diffuse and the translucent BSDF. And what this allows me to do now is with this value slider, it allows me to drop it way down and reduce the amount of translucency. And we only want it pretty low. And of course, we can also play with these HSV values. And in fact, we are going to drive the hue value using a technique that'll allow it to give it variation across the whole system. But for now, that's looking good. And let's zoom out. And let's also add just for testing purposes, let's add something to cast a shadow onto this leaf. So let's just add a cube and make it really long, like a plank or something. And then if I lift it up and over, you can see we're casting the shadow on the top surface, of course, like so, but it's also showing on the back face there as it should do. Now it's quite a sharp shadow at the moment, and that's because our light is a very small size. So if we increase the size, it'll soften that shadow a bit. But that's looking pretty cool. Okay, so one other thing is adding this variation into this shader. Before we duplicate these and add them to all these other ones, I want to create the ability to vary across the ivy growth system. So first, let's go back to frame 0. And now that we've developed our shader and I've done the testing, I'm going to delete these items. We don't need those anymore. And let's turn our environment, our sunlight and our environment back on. And we can also turn our ruins back on. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to only show the leaves. And in fact, because I've got the other ones hidden, it'll actually only show our leaf 01, which is good. So I'm going to, first of all, change our XP generator leaves to create render instances. And that'll just help with performance whilst I'm testing here. Let's come around to the front and let's activate this generator. And now if I scrub along to a point where there's an absolute load of leaves on screen, like so, we get this ability to, well, actually, let's go back a little bit further, a little bit more, just so it's nice and lightweight. And let's look at this part here. So currently, all of our tones, our hues are the same, because obviously it's just duplicating the same texture, which has the same hue, same RGB values. And what we need to be able to do is change the hue saturation and value based on an object ID, so a unique part of this geometry. And what we can do is we can do exactly as I showed you in the stones material, is we can actually use an object info node, and I can drop that in here, and we'll work on the top one here. And what we can get this to do is we can, if I solo this now, for instance, you can see our plane objects, our geometry for our leaves are assigned random values from 0 to 1. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually have that drive an HSV node, the hue on it. So let's add an HSV node. And I'm going to connect it up in between the top leaf diffuse and the principled BSDF. Okay, now let's connect up the random factor and drive the hue with it. Now immediately you'll see it has a very big impact, but what it's doing is remember it's from 0 to 1. And if we actually detach that, so if I alt and drag to cut that connection, if I just manually move this, 0.5 is unchanged. So you can think of it, if we think of it in a hue a hue color wheel, this would be, your 0 degrees. And then all the way around here would be 180 degrees. And then the same round this way, 360 degrees, we've just ended up round exactly the same way. So what we want it to do is we do want it to vary like that, but we want it to vary within a much tighter range. And we actually have a group node installed, and it's called range mapping. Now we have an extra bonus video on this, so if you want to see how this was made, you can go and check that out, or not. If not, just install this .cyg with the scenes and you'll be able to utilize this. So I'll connect this up. I'm going to connect this up in between. So let's connect up the input value, and then the mapped value then goes into the hue. Now what this allows me to do is it allows us to have the input of 0 to 1, those colors, 0 to 1, the black to white values, and all the grays in between. And then we can map them and limit them to specific values either side of that. So if I say 0.5 and 0.5, the only values that are going to occur are exactly 0.5. But if I give it some variation either side of that, and then I added a few more on the other side of that, you'll start to see I get a bit more control over the variation. Now I want this to be super subtle, so we're only going to go for something like 0.05 either side of 0.5. So let's try 0.5 actually, and just, there we go. So we're not adding any of the blues in. So if I go to 5.5, they get a bit too blue. Whereas if I drop it to 0.45, we actually get these more natural tones in there. Okay, so that's a nice way to create variation in the color palette of our leaves. And now we're going to apply this same material to, or the conversion process, to all of these other materials. So let's just do one to start with, and then I'll fast forward through the other three. So I've just duplicated that. I've just control dragged the material, and we've got leaf 2 showing. Now, if I unhide it in our render here, and let's attach that material like so, and we can make sure those aren't showing. Let's go back and generate these, make sure they're generating. Like so. They're all going to look the same, of course, because I've just assigned this duplicate material. And let's zoom in. Okay. So now we can I can identify these if I actually change the hue quite extremely. So I could just come here and I could change the hue, and you can see which ones are our leaf 2. So I can just focus on one of these, perhaps just to develop the material. And let's just undo that change we did in here. Okay, so all we need to do is exactly as we did with the bottom image textures, is to just change the name to leaf 02. So we could just go leaf 02 and then leaf 02 here. However, there is a quicker way of doing this, and that's actually to utilize the Cinema 4D texture manager. So if I hit Shift T, you'll see we have a bunch of these materials and texture references, and you'll see we also have this, if I show you in the view here, if you set this active, this material, this is the material in the Cinema 4D scene. So you can see our references here are all the ones for the leaf 02. And what I can do is I can actually change these to leaf 02, leaf 02, and leaf 02. And that has now swapped all of those out nice and quickly for us. So I can do the same if there's any others. Now these are all the Cinema 4D materials, so I don't need to worry about those. And what I will do though, when I duplicate these for the other ones, I'm going to create those. I'm going to assign them here. So that's just a nice, neat way of doing that. And there we go. There's our materials being assigned. Everything's all automated because of the way we've set up the node graph. It's all procedural. And we can now ripple through the other ones. So I'm going to do that, and we'll come back, and then we'll be dealing with the branches. All right, so we have our 5 leaf variants, and they're all the same, except for I've replaced the PNGs for each one, and I've also assigned them to their correct geometry. I've also gone ahead and removed the Cinema 4D materials because we don't need those anymore. And let's zoom in and have a little closer look. And you can see we're really starting to get that nice look with all the variation. And like I said, you could always just exaggerate or change the hue saturation values on this range mapping group. The minimum output, you could set that to 0 to 1 and get the full nice varied colors. But we don't want that for now. What we want to do is we want to deal with the branches. And we'll go step by step. So let's minimize our leaves. In fact, let's turn our leaves off for now. Jump into our spline mesher and let's activate all of them apart from the petiole, and I'll explain why in a bit. And let's zoom into a part where we see a few of these. There we go. Now this doesn't have to be an overly complex material. It just needs to be sort of a brownish color with a bump. So I'm going to delete the viewport material off there. And then I'm going to create a new material, and I'm going to utilize the same one, the Cycles 4D object material. That's just a preset. And if I drag that into our Ivy system, and I'm going to rename it now. I'm going to rename it CY stems. And then it's a simple principled BSDF node structure again, just connected up to the output. And what we're going to do is if I just set up a simple color for this for now. So let's just do a simple color, and then make sure it's assigned onto the XP Spline Mesher group. There we go. I'm going to actually work on sort of a noise for the bark here. And it can be pretty straightforward. Like I said, just a couple of noises layered up. And what we'll do is we'll start with just a noise texture, like so. And if I solo the color channel on this noise texture, we can see that it's assigned across these. And you can see it's assigned in a strange manner. It's actually using the UVs of the object. I'm going to make it use the overall size of the object and the coordinates of the object. So what we can do is you can assign a texture coordinate here. So search for texture and texture coordinate, add that in there. And then we just connect up the object to that. And now we'll have a more predictable noise. Okay. So with that, I can now change the scale of this. So I could change the scale and increase this up, way up, until the size of the detail is much smaller. There we go. A touch higher as well. We can also increase the detail, like so. And what we'll do is we'll connect this up to a bump map, a bump node, I should say. So search for bump, drag that in here, and then connect up. We're not going to connect up the color. We're actually going to connect up the factor because that's black and white, and that's going to be what we're going to use for our height map. So we connect that up to the height in the bump here. Let's unsolo that. Connect up our normal here. And that should load in and convert it into a bump. And you can see now on our branches already that's looking way more organic, just even having that one set of noises on there. Now I'm going to make it a bit more subtle. So maybe half that. And then we have this strength slider is just a multiplier for all of these things. So we could just drop that down as well. Like so. So that's actually nice and subtle. And I don't think I'm going to leave it with just the one bump. Now a bark obviously on a plant has these large cells of sort of detail on them, and a particular type of noise is useful for that, and that's a Voronoi. So here we go, there's the Voronoi. Let's add that in as well and utilize the same coordinates. And we can solo this channel here. So Cycles 4D makes that really easy to be able to just solo a particular channel and preview it in here. And you can see the size of that is way too high at the moment again. So let's go for a really high scale, which will give us small detail. And there we go. And you can see now that's like a bark in the sense that it's got sort of this cellular format sort of structure to it. And we don't need to mess around with any of the other settings. I'm just going to leave that there. You can try, in fact, actually, let's do a different one of these. There we go. Actually, that's probably a nicer, yeah, so that's a nicer structure there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to merge these together, and we don't do it in the same way as we do with a shader. The shader nodes like mix and add work only for shaders. So we want to use a mix, but it's a mix RGB. So we're mixing two colors together. And again, we're going to use the factors. Now it's fine to pump those into a color channel. It's just seeing them as black and white. And we're mixing them, but I'm going to mix them with an overlay. I can actually solo that channel as well. So let's mix them with an overlay, blend. Let that load in, and there you go. You can see we're getting this nice noise along the stems here. And I'm going to increase the blend here. Now I could go to one extreme. Let it load in, and then I'm going to rein it back a bit. I'm going to go to 0.8, like so. And then now we connect this up to our bump, like so. Unsolo it, and see what that looks like. And I think that looks nice. That's about the right level of detail for the distance we're viewing at. And it's just to break up these tree branches or these stems. Now the color obviously is all one color. And it would be nice to get some sort of variation in that, some different shading. And I'm just going to utilize this same black and white overlaid noises, and I'm going to ramp them into a different set of colors. So if I grab a color ramp, connect that up here, and then I can just connect that up to the base color. And now here's where we're going to just create a sort of a range of colors. So let's do a warm color. So it's going to be pretty similar to what we had earlier, sort of the brown color, sort of earthy colors. That's it. Let's start. I think we go pretty dark to start with. Yeah, that's a good one. Let's put that end, and let's get darker this end. So let's do nice deep brown color, and you can see here it's updating, and you can see even just with the two gradients nodes, we're getting a nice natural looking bark. So let's drop that down a bit more. Increase that one. And we can add a few more knots just depending on where we want them. Maybe like so. Oops, didn't mean to double click there. And, you know, we can just have slightly different shades, slightly different tones, just to basically give it a nice natural variation. I think that's looking pretty good. Let's zoom in. There you go. So zoom out. Doesn't need to hold up that close, but this distance is going to look excellent. Okay, and that really is it for our bark shader. We don't need to do anything particularly more complex than that. However, I am going to do something slightly different for the petiole. You'll notice I've left that one unchecked. Now, I'm going to actually utilize the trail of the petiole, and I'm going to turn that on. I'm going to duplicate the stems material, and I'm going to call it petiole, and I'm just going to assign that material there. Now you'll notice immediately that it's generated in the cycles RTP. However, I don't want it to do that. I only want it to be controlled by a tag, because the radius is currently a bit large. So I'm going to add a cycles curve tag. And there we go. And actually we're getting kind of an effect I'm after, which is this tapering away. And if you recall, the petiole had this size variation. Now we don't need to go that complex with this. I think we can just utilize the straight start size and end size. So let's go for like a low value here. It's going to be quite small. And let's actually do half that, 0.25. And then the end, it's not going to be 0 because it's going to be attaching to the leaf. So there we go, 0.1. And that's set nicely. Now if we turn the leaves on, remember they're on render instances at the moment, but we'll be able to generate them. There we go. And already you can see this coming together really nicely here with the balances of tones. But I do want to add one detail to the petiole material, and that's the fact that it can have sort of a gradient along it, so we can blend the green of the leaf, because the petioles actually, where they're connected to the leaf, they are actually green. So we want to blend between the green color of the leaf and the browner color of the bark. So what we can do, because this is a spline, and it's a hair, it's seen as like a, also you could, in the background, it could be seen as a hair. We can actually treat it like a hair. So we can grab an info node. And this one is, of course, a hair info node. And if I solo intercept, you can see intercept essentially is a black and white gradient, and it's black at the beginning of the spline and white at the end of the spline. And that's obviously very useful. It's like having a UV map along a tube piece of geometry. So you can actually change the color along the spline. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to mix in our color ramp here. And if I just move that color ramp over here, bring that over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to utilize a mix RGB. And I'm just going to connect the top one up. I'm going to connect the factor up to the intercept. And then I'm going to connect well, it's going to be the top one actually into the color ramp here. Now, if I solo that one, we should see a blend between this gray color and the browner color. And you can see that's happening. Now, I'm just going to make it a nice green color. Probably quite dark. Like so. And then I'm just going to connect that up to our principal BSDF. And you can see we're getting this nice blend from the branch to the leaf. And that's looking cool. Now, you'll notice if I zoom in that the splines they have a bit of a gap in them in places. And that's actually how Cycles 4D renders them at default, but usually they're so dense that it doesn't matter and you never see that. But what we'll do is we'll jump into our render settings. So jump into the render settings and we'll create a new render setting. Actually, in fact, let's just use this one. Let's go Cycles 4D. I want it to be double this resolution. So I'm going to set it to 2560. And let's call this one Cycles 4D, just so we know it's the beauty one. And if we go to the Cycles 4D tab, make sure your devices are set up correctly. And we might as well do this whilst we're here. Let's set up some clamping. So it's always good to clamp your direct and indirect rays so that they can't add more than a certain amount to any one pixel. So you end up you basically reduces fireflies and noise. So I pretty much always change those, and we're in quite a bright scene here, so it's probably useful to do so. Of course, you're going to want to increase the end samples. That'll depend on what render times you're getting and how much you want to tweak that stuff. But really what I'm looking for is I'm going to scroll all the way down and we're looking at curve rendering. Now I'm going to change this from curve rendering from line segments to curve segments. And the curve segments just means that will be a continuous, seen as a continuous object now. All right, so let me zoom out. And I think we might be able to reduce down. Actually, no, that bump's fine. It's looking good at this distance. Excellent. And let's zoom out again. And let's actually jump into one of our cameras. So let's jump into the mid camera. So this is quite a nice angle. That's looking really good. And we can tweak the light for this, and we could change the time slightly. So if we jump up to the top of the hierarchy, we've got our sunlight, and we can jump to the sun tag. And I'm actually quite happy with that. You could go to very specific times, something like that. Changing the seconds isn't going to make any difference, but changing the minutes and the hours definitely is much more significant. And you could get these beautiful sort of twilight hours I think 5 is the golden. Yeah, there we go. So that's quite nice. But we'll jump back to sort of near 3 in the afternoon. Like so. And I think that's going to be pretty good for us. Okay, so we might have a look at some depth of field, like I mentioned earlier. Not too much. We just want a very subtle amount of depth of field just to knock out some of the foreground. So we could jump to the camera tag here, and I could either use the radius. Now radius is the sort of the radius of the aperture, and it's very sensitive. So you can see I've made that huge. It's even just a small change will make a big difference there. If I'm just going to use an f-stop value, which is kind of natural to the camera, and that's just knocking the edges off that boundary there, which I really like, and also just up the front here. It's looking really good. Let's try the close-up one. So let's jump into the close-up camera. And this one, just to demonstrate, let's jump into this one and let's actually utilize the radius. So there we go. Now obviously that's very sensitive. In fact, we can probably drop that by a factor of 10. And we're just sort of slightly blurring out the ground there. Excellent. Okay. So that's looking good. One last thing to just experiment with is actually just to see what the blooms look like. So we're going to do all of our lighting effects in post. However, it's just sometimes useful to be able to prototype it in the real-time preview. And you can do that using the post effects tab in the camera, side camera tag. And if I hit the bloom one, which is the one we'll be using mostly here, and I increase the threshold, you can see that we get this really nice looking soft look to our image. Could argue that's getting into the Instagram filter territory. Drop the radius down. We could even try some glares, like so. You can see that's obviously very intense, but that's fun to prototype with those. So they're there if you want to play with them. I like to use those sometimes just to see how it's going to look. Obviously right now I'm just interested in the blooms. Let's jump into this one and add the bloom effect on this camera tag. There we go. So yeah, we're getting a really nice look. And let's turn those off so we don't accidentally bake those into our renders. And talking of the renders, let's just do one final thing on the setup. We're going to activate we need some object IDs. I want some IDs to be able to isolate certain things. And I'm going to create a cryptomat pass by checking both object and material on. And then you'll need to assign a file name here. So save a file name to save the cryptomat directly, and it'll generate a .exr file with cryptomat at the end of it. And what you need to do for Cycle's post effects, multipass, is to set it as post effects. So in the multipass setting here, click there, right click and add post effects. And then of course you can set your save formats and all that to your personal preference. And then of course we're going to want to set our frame ranges as well. But I think we can call that a wrap for our render part of our Ivy project. And hopefully you've enjoyed that. This is looking really nice now, and I'm looking forward to compositing these frames. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing in part 6. So I'll see you there.